there's already more work to be done than there are people to do it when it comes to design work. Literally every design organization I work with is understaffed by orders of magnitude relative to the ask from the company that they are part of.
After our last episode where Phillip Maggs outlined a vision for automating design production work, we asked ourselves, how might design organizations need to change as a result of AI? To answer this, we spoke to the best in the industry, Peter Merholtz, who co-authored the book Org Design for Design Orgs. While our focus is on design, what we discuss will help anyone working on product teams.
90% of companies are design immature. They cannot take advantage of what design has to offer. And I suspect the same thing is true of, let's call them algorithm maturity. So that even if they had this ability, they wouldn't be able to take advantage of it because of the ability of the humans in the firm to know what to do with this capability.
This is episode 21, and we're having our most important conversation about design struggles. This includes scaling design teams, and therefore scaling their problems. How designers and design leaders are overwhelmed. AI's potential impact on design. Doubts about personalization and adaptive experiences. And what designers need to do to succeed.
To be able to nurture a culture of experimentation and curiosity has almost less to do with AI than it does with that leader's just kind of mindset and will in making a space within an organization to enable that play. There are going to be some who are getting out ahead of this and are intrigued by AI and will be able to make some space to allow some people to play with it.
Peter Merholtz has worked at the intersection of design, technology, and humans for over 25 years. Currently, he's an independent consultant focused on improving the effectiveness of design organizations. His clients include JP Morgan Chase, Ceridian, the New York Times, Roblox, and Starbucks. He co-founded Adaptive Path, the premier user experience consultancy, acquired by Capital One in 2014. After leaving Adaptive Path, he served as a design executive, leading teams at Groupon, OpenTable, Capital One, Snagajob, now Snag, and Kaiser Permanente. He co-wrote Org Design for Design Orgs, still the premier book on building in-house design teams, and he co-hosts Finding Our Way, a podcast exploring design leadership. Oh, and yeah, he coined the word blog. Follow him on LinkedIn and contact him via his website. I'm also excited to announce that in 2 weeks I'll be launching a shorter format compendium podcast, focusing on behavioral science of AI. How we can use behavioral science and our understanding of user behavior to study, plan for, and build AI systems that move people to action. While design of AI will continue to focus on product teams, behavioral science of AI will be geared towards strategists, researchers, and really anyone who wants to bring a human focus to their work. Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast, where we interview AI leaders and discuss the latest innovations. We help teams learn how to leverage AI to reshape their industries. If you like learning about AI and how to grow your career, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting app. To get more AI and career resources, make sure to subscribe to our Substack at designofai.substack.com. It also really helps us if you leave reviews. I'm going to start with something that is a bit of an invitation to release your inner nerdiness if you care to today. In the research that I was doing leading up to our conversation today, one of the things that I thought was so fun was that you were the one who coined the term blog, but not that you coined the term blog. I was reading in part that it was someone else had coined the term weblog, which makes a lot of sense. It's a very technical term. And the term blog, we all know it is synonymous. But I just love the fact that you coined it by making it so human, by taking apart weblog to we blog. I just love that. So that was my nerdiness to start us off.
I mean, my nerdiness there is I started reading when I was 3. So I've always been a words person. Even as a designer, I'm a words person. The way people know me in the industry is largely through having written. And so I ended up being an early web blogger, as we were called, in 1998. And as a joke, I shifted the syllable one letter over between web and log to we and blog. And it caught on among the readership that I had. But it would have probably died on the vine if I didn't happen to know the people at Pyra Labs who, on a weekend lark, built a tool called Blogger, which then got acquired by Google, and the concept of blogging exploded. So yes, as someone who loves words, plays word games, I love Wordle, I love Boggle, I love language, to be in the OED, because largely for being silly, is definitely a source of kind of personal pride and fulfillment, and will definitely be the first thing, regardless of what else I do, will be the first thing on my obituary and possibly on my tombstone.
I love that. Okay, carrying on from your love of words and your love of reading and writing, you wrote a book called Org Design for Design Orgs in 2015 to give guidance on how to build design teams. Over the last 10 years since then, what have you found has really stood out as the biggest transformations that are shifting how design teams are being organized?
Before I get started, I do want to clarify that I co-wrote a book, my fellow author Kristen Skinner. I went on that journey with about 10 years ago now. And in the 10 years, you basically ask kind of what's changed or what's happened in those 10 years. Design teams got big. So when we wrote the book, we were writing it in 2015 and it was published in 2016, if I remember the dates right. And in 2015, Adaptive Path had only just gotten acquired by Capital One, and that's where Kristen was working. And that was one of the largest design orgs that we knew of, like single design organizations. And I think it had about 100 and 125 people at the time. And so when we wrote the book, we didn't really imagine design organizations of much larger than that. And we for the book, we have this chapter on the evolution of design organizations, and we tap it out at about 60 people in a design org. If your design org is bigger than this, it's basically just like this, only at scale, right? It's multiples of this. And probably the biggest difference I've come to realize in the last 10 years is that there are important scale differences above 60. You hit thresholds at about 150, and then you hit another threshold at about a little over 300, and you might hit another one once you get over like 500 or 600, where things change in the organization. That matters. The role of design operations becomes essential. I supported a design organization that grew from 350 to about 1,000 over the last few years. And within that design organization, there was an operations function that repeated what you would get from your typical corporate operations in terms of HR, finance, learning and development, IT, all of those things, but was replicated within the design org, because what designers, and I'm saying design broadly, this team had design, research, and content were the pillars of the organization. Those folks need enough special attention that it made sense to have like a 50-person, if not larger, operations team to help the 900 plus other people do their best work. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
Just to put context on that, can you give us a rough idea on how many designers an Airbnb might have versus a Meta?
I don't have those numbers. My sense would be that Airbnb probably has 100 to 200 designers. It's not the biggest of companies. Meta's probably got well over 1,000 now. I know Google has well over 4,000 to 5,000. And again, designers, UXers. The company I was speaking to about specifically was JP Morgan Chase, where the consumer bank had about one people in UX. And then there was roughly another 700 to 1,000 UXers in other parts of Chase Bank. So corporate and investment bank, internal tools, commercial bank, and then kind of random teams at wealth management and other stuff that you would uncover. And so there was nearly 2,000 UXers across Chase Bank, which made it more than any other bank that I know. I know that Capital One has about 600 to 700 people in a design and UX function.
Taking that piece, you mentioned that teams had to scale up. One of the risks and one of the outcomes of that, and something you've spoken about quite a bit recently, is this idea that designers can become pixel pushers. Someone like John Cutler, who looks at a lot of organizational design, he's worried about the idea of feature factories. So all of this centers around this idea of once you get to scale, you lose the holistic piece of design. What do you think the state of design is right now?
The trick there is to a certain degree, you need some pixel pushers, right? You need the production work to happen, right? That's at the end of the day what, kind of in some stark terms, what the design function is delivering to the rest of the organization is a set of detailed specifications of the user experience, which you could interpret as pixels. What we understand, and by we, I mean the three of us and probably the smart people listening to this podcast understand, is there's a lot, there could and should be a lot of thinking that happens beforehand that leads to that detailed delivery. And it's that work that can get lost in organizations that are particularly where the non-design leadership is unaware of all the work that goes into making those pixels in a more design mature organization. It's a little orthogonal to John Cutler's discussion of feature factories. I've witnessed feature factories, and there's probably some relationship between feature factories and pixel pushing. Right, the idea behind a feature factory is that, and you actually referring to financial services, you see this model. Feature factories are common in legacy enterprises. And when I say legacy enterprises, I'm referring to companies that are pre-internet, pre-digital, that have had to adopt software development in order to sustain. So whether it's financial services like banks, health and healthcare, insurance services, retail, et cetera. And what often happens in those environments is that the business is divorced from the digital delivery, right? In fact, digital delivery might exist in kind of an IT function. And when that happens, those IT functions are feature factories, right? They have very little control over what gets built. They have some control over how it gets built and maybe the details of execution. But all the real decision making has happened in this separate entity called the business that is essentially issuing requirements to the technologists in terms of what to build. And that can, and so when design is operating in that mode, all the user research in the world, all the strategy in the world is useless, because again, the decisions were already made. The opportunity is, how do we position design and user experience as not just a production function, but a definition function, a strategy function? For example, thinking back to Chase Bank, when Karen, who was the chief design officer who brought me in, she since left a few months ago, but over 3 years ago when she was brought in, she really wanted to emphasize the strategic opportunity of design. And there was a lot that went into it. I could soliloquize for too long, but specific to what we're just talking about now is she used the double diamond as a communications tool to inform anyone who was listening that design isn't simply production and execution, i.e. the second diamond, but there's a lot of value that can be generated in the work in the first diamond. And for like 2 years, she just hammered away, and any opportunity to communicate about design involved the double diamond, until she realized she didn't have to use it as much anymore because it started sinking in. And so just wanting to kind of stress partly the time it takes, that you need communication strategies, like to move out of this production mode, this pixel pushing mode, this feature factory mode is a political effort and requires political means such as communication strategies in order to elevate the practice of design and user experience.
Now, a lot of this last decade, as you mentioned, seems to have been focused on operationalizing, strategizing, figuring out how things should be organized and who should be where. But the last 2 years, a lot of the conversation tech's been about AI. I'd love to know, what do the tech leaders that you speak with think about AI?
Um, what do they think about AI? So most of the people I'm engaging with in tech are design and UX leaders. I'm not talking to a lot of engineers, or occasionally I talk to product people. And I think when it comes specifically to the design and user experience leaders, at this point, at least the ones who talk to me, they're not thinking about it a lot. They're curious about it, right? They all saw the demo at Config and what Figma can do. You put in a prompt and out comes some interface, and they're wondering about it, but it hasn't yet been all that relevant to design practice. It is in some companies. So on our podcast, we just interviewed Leslie Witt, who is the chief product and design officer at Headspace. And at a place like Headspace, they're exploring AI as a means of, the user experience, right? Like, how can AI inform an improved user experience for someone seeking the kind of health or de-stressing or kind of other value that a service like Headspace provides. So there's definitely interest in AI as this material to play with, to manipulate, to leverage in delivering a better user experiences. There's some concern, I suppose, in AI kind of replacing design and designers, though the leaders I talk to aren't personally concerned because they're not the ones like in the details. They might be concerned on behalf of their team. But I think at this point, it's still very much a cautious curiosity more than
And
anything else.
how would you characterize those leaders that are more curious, the ones that perhaps are exploring or nurturing a culture of experimentation?
To be able to nurture a culture of experimentation and curiosity has almost less to do with AI than it does with that leader's just kind of mindset and will in making a space within an organization to enable that play. And I guess as you were asking that question, I think there's a kind of fork in the road. There are going to be some who are getting out ahead of this and are intrigued by AI and will be able to make some space to allow some people to play with it. How might AI change and ideally improve our processes, right? What can we do faster and better that, much the same way of any automation, right? What can we do faster and better? What can we let the computers do faster and better so that we can reserve our own thinking and time for that which only humans can do? So I think about things like in UX research, some form of transcript analysis over a large corpus of data that you get from qualitative research. That could be an interesting opportunity. So that's one direction. The other direction, be born more of honestly anxiety of like, oh, is this going to eat my lunch? And it's not necessarily experimentation in that mindset of the fullness of how might we, and more like, oh, I better learn this or I'm going to get fired, which probably honestly puts some blinkers on in terms of one's approach to embracing AI, because you're looking at it very almost transactionally, and as opposed to in a generative creative sense, it's very much like how can we use this tool to help us produce faster, because if we don't, will we be laid off or something like that.
As a researcher and as someone who likes to understand deep human insights, I do think it's interesting how reticent people in the design community have been, and also in the research community, but generally across the UX community, to adopting that sense of experimentation around AI, especially because some of the biggest early use cases have been around allowing for greater, deeper, faster creativity and exploration around that design and creative space. So you mentioned about some of the reasons why these design leaders have been hesitant around, not wanting to take jobs or just not having a culture of exploration or experimentation, which again, you think we would all want to be more creative and experimental, but we'll put a pin in that part. What are some other reasons that you're seeing that is causing people to not adopt this allowance for playfulness in design through technology?
Well, specifically when I think about AI, I do think, if I'm being charitable, there's a healthy skepticism. I mean, a lot of the conversation around AI is nonsense. There's the hype cycle, and we're at the tippy top of the hype cycle. And given a healthy skepticism, and given that most design leaders and their teams are already overwhelmed with things to do, anything that is not of obvious value just might not make it through the filter, right? You have to focus on that which is meaningful. And it's not clear what parts of AI are meaningful. This has frankly kind of been my approach. I have not dived into AI except to do a little bit of kind of transcript analysis stuff for some personal projects because there's so much noise and you can spend a lot of time seeking clarity in this noise. And I would rather let some people with the inclination, interest, pioneering sensibility do that exploration on my behalf. I don't need to be the one to figure it out. I will happily follow what other people have figured out once they've spent a lot of time navigating and are the image generation tools like your mid journeys and whatnot, how best to incorporate those, Figma's AI tools, how best to incorporate those, research, et cetera. Like there's a lot. Also, generative AI versus LLMs versus these and those and the other things. Like there's just a lot of noise. I think the AI industry can get away with the noise right now because there's so much curiosity and interest. If you were to consider this like any other market category, all this noise would be a problem because it's just kind of, you don't know where to begin. It's the paradox of choice. There's too much. And so you just say, screw it. Tell me what to do. And we haven't reached that stage yet.
Right now, with all these challenges where there's too much noise, is this a time for external vendors to be the filters, or should there be a resuscitation of innovation groups internally to educate and train and build education back into workflows?
One thing I'm a little surprised about is that I haven't seen AI for design consultancies or as an offering within a design consultancy really flourish. Now, maybe it's happening and I'm not witnessing it. I have some familiarity with the design consultancy space, and it seems like a missed opportunity to really dig into that and then kind of market yourself as someone who can help clients navigate this noise. My guess is there's a separate conversation to be had about what's happened to design consultancies over the last decade, where the middle just evaporated, right? So where Adaptive Path was, a 30 to 50 person firm for the last 6 or so years of its existence, those kinds of 30 to maybe 70 person design firms are just, they've gone the way of the American buffalo. Either they've retrenched and they're now small boutiques of 15 or fewer, or they got acquired and they became part of Accenture and they became part of Capgemini or whatever. Speaking from my experience as Adaptive Path and kind of the work that we did to establish user experience to help clarify some of the noise around user experience and to help companies understand kind of a way into user experience, or Cooper was in the same kind of position. I think maybe we're missing this contributor just in the conversation. They've just disappeared. And so yes, any management consultant will tell you that they will help you navigate the confusion that is AI, whether or not they know what they're talking about. They have no compunction of putting themselves out there as experts.
It's true.
And very expensive ones, right? So a lot of folks are going to say no. And the boutique firms, maybe there's a little bit of risk. Like they it might almost be a little too uncertain just what the market is for design for AI services. And when you're that small, you need to make sure that what you're getting is dependable. And so you're gonna leverage what you're already known for, not necessarily something new.
You have a lot of conversation with these design leaders, whether they are AI bearish or bullish, right? But what are the questions or the help that they actually are looking for around implementing things like AI or just generally emerging technology into their workflows to be better, more efficient, allow their designers more time to be strategic? What are the actual questions that they need answered or that they need guidance with that you're hearing?
I think something that hasn't been addressed in our conversation yet is around ethics. I think design is often, perhaps because of our humanistic tendencies in design and research, we tend to have an ethical mindset in terms of how we work. And there's a lot of reasonable misgivings around the ethical basis of how most of these AI companies are doing their work. Like, I don't think there exists a training model out there that was ethically sourced in any public AI tool. Full stop. If I'm wrong, please tell me. Can we even use this in good faith? From the beginning, it seems so ethically compromised. And so that would be one. Like, which of these tools can I use? Is Adobe the legitimate one? Why is it when I go on Reddit or social media or whatever, people are like, well, actually, there's a lot of well actuallys in this space. Are there ethical tools or ethical means by which you can embrace AI and navigating that? And then within it, I think the primary question around where a design consultancy could help in internal teams with this would be probably twofold. One, how might it really effectively improve how we do our design work? So, design process in a way that takes away production-y scut work and allows the team to focus on the higher order, more strategic elements of design. So that's one thing. Part of the reason Figma is so wildly successful is that it's not simply a design tool. It is a product team tool that kind of starts with design. It has taken off because it allows designers, product managers, engineers, and whomever else is involved in the conversation to better collaborate. So that would be the other kind of question mark is, what is the role of AI in tooling, cross-functional tooling, and how might it improve? Because in a lot of environments, that's a fraught dynamic. So how might it improve how these different functions collaborate?
One perspective on this was shared in our previous episode with Phillip Maggs from Superside. He came on, they presented at Figma, and their point of view is that design systems, content strategies, brand guidelines can all be turned into an LLM, and you could feed it nice briefs and take care and automate a lot of production work. The point here is to take some of that grunt work, some of the rote design tasks that hopefully should elevate designers more strategically. From your perspective, do you think it's a good thing to automate the production of emails, banners, landing pages, etc., or not?
I don't know if I have a moral or ethical point of view on that from a good or bad standpoint. I think it would largely be beneficial, I guess is where I'm coming down to, right? The arc of history is definitely around automating that which computers can do better than humans, going to Bezier curves and desktop publishing or, typesetting. So I remember one of my first serious design leadership roles was at Groupon. And Groupon was very regional, right? It had basically guides for each of the cities that it operated in. And we would have to churn out, I had a team of designers who would have to churn out these assets for each city. You could use some automation tools, string together, Illustrator, Photoshop, and script automators on a Mac and kind of do this stuff. But man, what a pain in the ass. And you have to lay in different city images and all that. Like, if you could automate something like that so that you could create 200 city specific images for advertising or whatnot, that you would want a human to review all of that, right? We know the hallucinations and other folly of AI. But instead of someone spending 5 days trying to cobble together that, if they could spend 2 hours reviewing what a computer did on their behalf for something like that, that strikes me as a good idea. Yeah.
You brought up historical precedents. When was the last time that we were in this position where there's some emerging technology? We know it's helpful, but we're not really sure how to use it. Was it in the late 90s when the web was starting to pop up? Was it when mobile was starting to arise? When was the last time we were in this position, and how did we navigate through it?
It's a little interesting to me that the rise of design systems didn't quite catch the flack that AI has, and maybe there was still enough manual labor in creating design systems that people weren't as afraid for their jobs. But the whole point of design systems, literally, the point of design systems is you need fewer designers because the system has a lot of the intelligence and decision making embedded within it, such that Greg Petroff, who I've interviewed for the podcast and is a friend of mine, was the head of a VP of UX, or I forget exactly his title, at GE. And there was no way that GE was going to hire enough designers for all the systems and tools that GE has. He had a team of about 50 people. And so from day one, he's like, well, you're going to have to build a design system because that's the only way we are going to be able to communicate a design standard across this organization. Because unlike IBM, which was also kind of building at the same time, IBM made a call, we're going to hire 2,000 designers or whatever. GE's like, nope, that's not our path forward. So they had to build a design system. Did it take away jobs? No, those designers probably would have never been hired. Definitely allowed for all these different divisions of GE to hire fewer designers because now your engineers could plug this design system in to your real data and have something that didn't suck ass out of the gate, which is, what would have been the situation otherwise. Design systems is the reason we're able to scale design. Right. This is why we have design teams of in the hundreds, kind of ironically given what I was just saying, where it's all part of the same trend around the scaling of design. Design systems are a means of scaling design. Design operations are a means of scaling design. Hiring hundreds of designers is a means of scaling design, right? They're all kind of part of the same trend of recognizing that we need design in more places than we'd had it in the past. Again, it just kind of avoided any controversy. Not totally. I guess there was some concern around how design systems would routinize design. So it was less concern about jobs, more concern that it was turning design like production job, where your ability to do the work was kind of constrained by a predetermined um, means by which you were going to solve problems.
That raises the elephant in the room when it comes to probabilistic systems like this is we could potentially output such a high ratio that there's no way to possibly QA it. How does that
Mm.
land for a design leader?
I guess it lands for design leader in the same way it lands that any overwhelm lands for a design leader, which is having to choose where they focus their attention and energy. There's already more work to be done than there are people to do it when it comes to design work. Literally every design organization I work with is understaffed by orders of magnitude relative to what is kind of the ask from the company that they are part of. And so what that means, among other things, is kind of to the GE point. There's a lot of stuff that is going out the door that designers never touched. And one of the questions or challenges that a lot of design leaders face is just how much of that do they try to get involved with? And my counsel to them is only follow through on that which you can feel good about in terms of your team's engagement and the quality of the work, and let everything else just go. You just have to let some stuff go. Because if you spread yourself too thin, you're going to deliver a bunch of mediocrity, which will actually reflect badly on design. People won't be happy that design touched everything before it went out the door. They'll be maybe not disappointed, but they'll be meh on design because everything it touched was kind of meh. Whereas if design orgs focus their efforts on that where they can do really good work, yes, you might have some people pissed off at you who never got design attention, but the things that got design attention are going to look amazing. Design will be associated with quality. And that's how you build the flywheel to get the resources you need to do more and better design work elsewhere. You need a filtering mechanism by which you focus your attention. That's how I see them trying to address the kind of potential overwhelm of so much design happening. There's more than can be QA'd, though. You're going to see AI tools for QAing of designs created through AI, right? You're going to have this weird snake eating its tail of AI, and the humans just kind of standing back and watching this all happen.
Have you seen the computer use demos where you actually watch Cloud doing this thing? And it's really fascinating to watch. But then there's a critique of it. It's like, do we want software that we have to monitor on a daily basis?
You get all these AI tools producing content, and then other people's AI tools consuming and distilling that content, and you're just like, what are we even doing here?
We're already kind of there anyways because we're reaching the limit of what these LLMs have been trained on. The next step is basically synthetic training data, where the AIs are creating content that can then be used to train the AIs to create more content. It's
That
a
that
separate
can only go
conversation, though.
well.
So I want to bring us back to where we were a minute ago. I loved your answer about, what was the last sort of big innovation that really impacted designers, and talking about design systems and how the implication of that was ultimately that new people maybe weren't hired. So those teams weren't necessarily scaled in the way that we had previously been seeing. And if we think about then, design teams starting to use Gen AI to automate more rote design tasks. For me personally, I've been having a lot of conversations within the agency I work at and outside of it, where we've historically been looking at the way that we design things from a user journey perspective. More linearly, we understand where they are and where we want to get them. In Gen AI experiences, and the more that we start to work within that, they're generally nonlinear. It's more of you have to design for the ecosystem that exists there, because you don't really know where someone's going to go and how it will be used. How do you think that these design teams using more Gen AI to automate these design tasks and changing the ways in which designers need to work, how will that change the org design for those design orgs?
So Gen AI driven experiences with that kind of variability really only makes sense in a pure software context. Whereas when I think about journeys, I'm thinking about, I mentioned legacy enterprises, right? Banking, I don't know what the role of Gen AI is in banking, but the journey is going to basically stay the same in terms of like getting an account because you need a checking account or a savings account, or getting a home loan or whatever. And that, like, those journey models will stay the same. Or travel. Every time I talk about journeys publicly, I use the Rail Europe experience map that Adaptive Path created 15 years ago as an illustration of a travel experience, right? And you have to like plan where you want to go, coordinate with other people, do some comparison shopping across different services. You buy the tickets, and then you have that experience after you've bought the tickets, but you're now planning to go on the trip, and then you go on the trip, right? And like those stages of the journey, they're not going anywhere regardless of Gen AI. I could imagine in some forms of like a Duolingo, or it's a real kind of pure software experience based on where you started or the nature of what you're doing, kind of the paths forward could be quite variable, right? I think actually language learning is an interesting one. Gen AI tuned right to a language learner, there's some people who could likely get scaffolded and develop a language competency much faster than others. And Gen AI could enable that in a way that currently you'd have to create multiple different learning paths for different kinds of things.
Let's imagine Josh Clark was here. He was on a couple of weeks ago from Big Medium, and he's writing the book Sentient Design. He talks a lot about radically adaptive experiences. And if going back to the banking example, what it could be, and I prefer to look at Gen AI not as this magical infinite box of opportunities. I prefer to look at it as a micro quanta big data. And from that perspective, if I have a banking app, what should it know about me? And to what level of data privacy am I comfortable providing information? Should it know that I'm about to have a baby? Should it know that my mother's in debt? Should it know that my company is at risk of going under? There's like an infinite web of possibilities, both dark and positive ones, of how much a banking app could or should know about you. And that's the piece about the radically adaptive piece, because if you look at it from a very humanistic perspective, the agent with which you have a relationship at the bank would have a lot of context awareness about you. They would have a lot of situational understanding of your life and who you are in and outside of the numbers. This software, one day, maybe 10 years from now, could know those things. Should it know those things? I don't know, right? But this is the ethics piece. This is the possibilities piece. This is the future casting piece, which is really fascinating about right now.
So, two distinct thoughts. First is personalization, and the second is regulation, for lack of a better word. So, on the personalization front, like what you're explaining in terms of a banking app, understanding who I am as a human in the world, my life events, etc., and thinking, actually reflecting on what I was saying around learning development. I worked for a professor at the University of California, Berkeley in 1991, who was all hot up on the opportunity for computers to tailor instruction to every student based on their learning styles, et cetera, et cetera. 1991. We've been talking about personalization ever since Amazon launched, and much more actively probably starting in 2000, 2001. People who bought this book also bought, and Firefly and these personalization algorithms and all this kind of stuff. I'm dubious of radically adaptive AI succeeding where all these other attempts have failed, because we kind of have the technology to do what we're talking about. But for whatever reason, in many instances, it has not taken root. It has not flourished. It hasn't happened. And I don't know enough. I'm not enough of a technologist to know why all these algorithms that we've had for the last 30 years around personalization haven't worked, and why Gen AI is now the secret sauce to enable it. So that's one piece. But the piece about banking that's interesting is what a banker knows about me is almost immaterial, at least in the United States, because banking is such a proscribed, regulated experience that you could possibly replace a human with an AI, and I as a customer wouldn't necessarily even know the difference. There's all these digital banks now. The AI is going to be limited the same way humans are limited right now in banking by structures beyond their control. I would be cracking a walnut with a sledgehammer instead of a nutcracker. It's a very simple series of if-then statements can handle much of what banking needs. I don't need a radically adaptive AI. Now, it would be interesting in something much more fluid like language learning or something. And again, I'm speaking now, I'm going beyond my depth. But that gets to the first point, which is people have been trying personalization for literally 30 years, and it keeps not quite living up to whatever promise it is. And I suspect it's not a technology problem. I suspect it's either a design problem, but frankly, what I suspect is it's an organizational problem, i.e., so we talk a lot about design maturity in our industry. And 90% of companies are design immature. They cannot take advantage of what design has to offer. And I suspect the same thing is true of, let's call them algorithm maturity. My guess is 90% of corporations are algorithmically immature, so that even if they had this ability, they wouldn't be able to take advantage of it because of the ability of the humans in the firm to know what to do with this capability. And instead, you're just going to kind of continue to slog along as is, because the constraint has been people all along.
I love this because it integrates systemic thinking into the mix, and the utopian, crazy, batshit crazy stuff coming out of tech bro land needs this reality check. But in terms of firm grounding comments, a couple of weeks ago we had Spotify's former data alchemist Glenn McDonald on. Fabulous episode, because he talked about personalization. He says it's a fool's errand. Do not try to personalize. You just need to do the job of a user researcher, and you need to understand where they're trying to get to and take any roadblocks out of the way that's possible. But the idea of personalization as a goal is insane. And it's funny to hear someone who is a mathematician, who's an algorithmic designer, saying that, because it proves your point. Now, the second piece here is
I should listen to that episode. That sounds, I hadn't realized at least part of our industry has recognized this, right? But personalization should never be a goal, but can it be an ingredient within something else? Like, I am addicted to YouTube. It's one of my perhaps unfortunate tendencies, but give me 15 minutes, I plop on a sofa and I fire up YouTube. Whether or not it's personalized, the recommendation algorithm does a pretty decent job, right? And I benefit from it.
another point, which is we had Christy J. Fisher on, who worked at Google and YouTube, and she works at PlayStation now. And she was talking that YouTube was a fascinating case study because they're optimizing for the wrong KPI. Their personalization was based off of initially what you were clicking on. So they started seeing all these cat videos shoot up, but they started coming to terms that they need better KPIs about time well spent, what you actually want to engage with, the things that you're spending the most time consuming, which is exactly what Glenn McDonald also was
Yep.
saying.
I think this is super crucial because this is about the paperclip generator, right? Like, these radically adaptive Gen AI types of experiences will very quickly go far off the reservation if they are tuned to the wrong
Yes.
problem.
But that circles us back to really where I believe the conversation needs to go with AI and particular design teams is we're seeing that the consumer applications are really uncertain. Even the monetizable B2B applications are very uncertain. But what seems to be a clear value add and driver right now is how we can augment and enhance the capabilities of a workforce. That seems to be
Of
where
the
the
team
focus.
itself. Yep.
Yeah,
Of the
an
whole
example.
workforce or the design workforce?
This is another philosophical question. Again, a lot of our guests claim that one of the biggest benefits of Gen AI is not what you can predict it can create, it's what you can't predict that it can create. And by
Sure.
that, Josh was saying that the weirdness of AI might be one of its biggest value adds. From a creative standpoint, it might be able to come up with ideas that you weren't expecting. And we actually don't know how to harness that yet because we're still very linear thinkers. And maybe AI will actually be an amazing new counsel to break us out of linear thinking. But the big question right now is if any of this is true, whether it's 1% or 20% of it's true, how does it change the org design of design teams?
What I have seen, at least in the last 10 years, basically since I've written the book, is definitely a shift of design organizations away from wholly centralized, like internal agencies, internal services teams, right? That was a model. That's basically dead for product design. Marketing design still often works that way, which is a separate problem. um, but product design teams almost never operate in that way. They are either embedded in product teams, or what we talk about in the book, and the phrase we coined for it is centralized partnership. You have the design organization centralized within a single head of design. You have a set of groups that are dedicated to different parts of the product experience. Now, sometimes that might be products, right? So if you're in a multi-product space, I've worked in HR, right? Or like HCM, human capital management, HR systems, right? And you might have a product for getting people paid, and a product for time management, and a product for learning and development. Each of those would be considered a product, and you would dedicate people to it. Or you'll do a more journey mode. Or you might do a journey mode, right? This is kind of the Airbnb example. I don't know how they're organized now, but at one time you had guests and hosts, and then you had kind of the stages of the journey would have teams dedicated to it, right? Figuring out where you're going to stay, and then the actual stay experience, and then things like experiences and stuff being distinct. Also within there, you then had the marketplace model, right? Distinct audiences, right? So if you've got guest and host, you might have the guest design team and the host design team. You might have a pro, if you have a professional consumer audiences, you might have a pro design team and a consumer design team, right? So these are the models by which design orgs are currently operating. The one thing that's also inside all of these design orgs, and this might actually be part of the answer to the question, is a platform team, right? Something kind of very horizontal. This is usually where design systems lives. And then often what are called shared experiences, right? So when I mentioned that HR tooling earlier, right, you might have, of designers dedicated to the compensation experience, a group of designers dedicated to time management, a group of designers dedicated to learning and development. But then you'll have a group of designers dedicated to things like the landing page and search and your account, and those things that kind of doesn't matter what the product is that runs across it. So that would all be part of a platform team. So an implication, I think, where AI will likely root itself initially in a design org would be within some type of platform team, kind of in a parallel with design systems, almost as this thing that we're figuring out. We don't quite know where it lives. This is a good place for it to hang out. Maybe it will inform the design system. There's something about that, or it can, from this platform orientation, plug into the different other teams as needed. So I can see a design platform team extending to embrace AI. The other place where it would affect it, to kind of Brittany, the question you were asking earlier, is if you have a radically adaptive AI experience where you no longer have a product as we normally think about it, but that design team dedicated to that product. If that product is radically adaptive, that design team will be working on what is the experience of using a radically adaptive AI product. And that might require a different set of skills than your typical design team. It might be much less about visual design and interaction design and all those things. It's not going to be prompt generation, but whatever the kind of gardening tools that you need as a designer in a radically adaptive AI world to kind of massage and tailor and nudge the experience as opposed to shape it, right? Because that's what we're trying to get away from, is the brittle shaping of an experience. When you move to this radically adaptive, the idea is that through a dialogue with the user, that experience can unfold. But there are likely going to be risks involved with that. I don't know what those skills are.
Okay, but
I love the way that you're answering this because so often the advice that we're hearing is every designer, you need to start playing around and you need to become an AI expert and all of this. But the way that you are envisioning it is there is still the place for designers as they are and UX professionals the way that they are. However, this is an additional different skill set and a different opportunity for people to move into that level of expertise around the experience of AI, which I think is really interesting. And putting a pin in that for a second, it brings me to maybe another question that is a little more global. Designers, whether you're in AI, non AI, whatever, designers generally exist in this sort of vortex of unintended consequences, right? Planning for and designing for the expected as well as the unexpected. What are some of the consequences that you could envision arising from automating an increasing amount of design over the next decade?
I am of the belief that experiences, by and large, have generally gotten better over the last 25 years. Like software user experiences, right? If you tried doing digital banking in the late 90s and you do it today, like it's better. It's just better today. And I think that's generally true across most software experiences that people have. There's still a lot of room for improvement. I think what the AI automatingness can continue to raise the floor. I don't think it'll raise the ceiling, but continue to raise the floor of these experiences, right? This is what design systems have done as an automating kind of function. And I would foresee that being a consequence of well managed, well gardened AI effort would allow us to spread that floor raising just across more and more and more experiences. Whether you're a bank or healthcare service, et cetera, these big enterprises, these massive enterprises, there are things that just continue to go untouched by human hands when it comes to design that AI could likely do some benefit to raise those floors. Something else. So I have the window with you guys on it, and below it, I have LinkedIn. It's RP. I was looking at your profile, and a message popped up on LinkedIn, which of course grabbed my attention. And it was around accessibility and inclusive design. And this is an area, accessibility and inclusive design is an area that has been drastically underinvested in forever and continues to be and will continue to be, probably. I find myself wondering, so things like accessibility, WCAG standards, that is AI. You would think kind of AI catnip, right? Just plug that right into your AI. And literally, there should be no interface built that doesn't meet those standards because we're just doing the check constantly because those standards are just embedded in the tools that we make. Inclusive design would be a little harder, right? Because that's more the art than the science of this stuff. But I could see benefit happening there. The unintended consequence of concern is what happens, I would say, less in the design process and more in the output, right? Where there's just stuff that we see with hallucinations that people believe that cause problems. I'm not too worried about unintended consequences within the design organization or the product development organization when it comes to this stuff, just because there's a cybernetic kind of loop. There's feedback so that we're always kind of checking in on that. And if something starts getting out of hand, there's probably enough people paying attention to kind of rein it back in. But with public experiences, and that's going to be true, that's already happening.
What's your perspective on the entire movement for democratizing tools and skill sets? Because one of the things that Gen AI tools is doing is devaluing insights work. It's making anyone feel like they can go out and get answers. And usually it sends qualitative answers where the nonsense starts getting populated. Obviously, we've seen
Yeah.
research become devalued. Will design get devalued? Will strategy get devalued?
Have we seen research become devalued? That is a hypothesis. I don't know if that's
I
what
think
I
the
have
big
seen.
data revolution was the biggest culprit to begin with. But I think
Um,
we're also speaking like
you
qualitative,
mean like things like A/B testing and that kind of stuff? What do you mean by data revolution in that regard?
just the sense that pulling from analytics and data sources is going to give you an empirically stronger insight. And then, yes, also usability testing, A B
Okay.
testing, things like that being the new
barometer versus being just the floor?
So I'm old enough to remember before at least A/B tests, and I can tell you research was not any more or less valued then than it is now. I mean, trying to convince a client to do usability testing with a statistically insignificant sample was a challenge even before we were data rich. And the reason I'm pushing back on this is because I think the issue is not a grand statement around democratization or valuing or devaluing of research and design and these other practices. The thing I come back to is your company or is your organization a learning organization, right? And I think this maps to maturity. What I have learned is that roughly 80% of companies don't learn, right? They had some initial insight that allowed them to succeed, and then they just kind of keep doing stuff and don't really grow and evolve. Research in those environments, research has just been already devalued. They might have hired a bunch of researchers because these environments are also the ones most likely to be subject to social contagions. When it appears that everyone else is hiring designers and researchers, they hire designers and researchers because they're like, I guess this is what we do. And then those designers and researchers start doing their work, and internally they're like, basically, we don't learn, so all the work of design and research goes for nothing. And eventually those folks get kind of managed out. Whereas there are companies, Netflix comes to mind. Netflix makes a lot of big mistakes. I was actually looking at an old deck of mine when they launched Quickster, and where they lost $10 billion in market value because of how they were doing something back in, this was 2011, 2012. But then they figured it out, they learned, they recovered. And then there was the Netflix correction in 22 or whatever. And then they learned, they figured it out, and they recovered, right? Netflix is a learning organization. They might make stumbles along the way, but they quickly recover because they know how to navigate the information that comes to them. And I can say Netflix has an active user research function. What's her name? Jocelyn. I met a long time ago, but who leads that team, right? So it's less about categorical valuing and devaluing and more how will this play into kind of pre-existing sentiments around the value of research, design, etc.
So,
Culture is the problem, and cultures don't change until they experience criticality, and even then, they often don't change for them to change.
That's a very heartbreaking and true insight. So
I
let's
am here
close.
to eyes wide open. That's my philosophy. Eyes wide open.
You're here to break my heart. It's fine, I get it. So let's end this on an optimistic note. As research and insights, we have strategy, we have design here through all of us. How can designers, strategists, researchers be collaborating better together so that in 5 years' time, we're all doing better work in AI space, using AI, not using AI, but generally just all in a more secure, more human centered, and just stronger position in the work that we do? What advice would you have for how everyone can be?
I think the trick to that is to let go of your professional identity and to instead lean on your skill set, because I see the biggest constraint for design and research to realize their full potential is one of identity. We as a designer do these things, product does those other things. If the product manager is not doing those things, well, I'm not going to do it because I'm a designer. It's not my responsibility. Whereas the people I see who actually succeed are those who are like, okay, I'm going to take on some of those product things if no one else is doing it because it needs to get done. Right. So I think this applies with what you're saying around strategists, researchers, designers, et cetera, working together to not let it become tribal and us versus them, or I only do this and you only do that, and to have your work defined by this label that you've slapped upon yourself, and instead to focus on the impact that you're seeking to make, the problem that you're trying to address, and talk amongst one another. What are the skills that we each bring to bear, and how can they complement one another so that we can work together to make the positive impact that we seek? That is the drum I am beating. I've been beating it for 25 years. I'll beat it for another 25. This is my white whale, my windmill to tilt at, is how people allow identity to blunt their own ability to have the impact that they say they want to have.
If I were to re-articulate something that you just said that I thought was especially worth repeating is I think we've also often lost the impact outcome that we're looking for or all working together. And by having that kind of a charter or a vision that you're working towards, it also allows it to be easier for you to see where you're going rather than just having a deck that you're building or a prototype or whatever those end artifacts are.
I think that's exactly right. In the Org Design for Design Orgs book, the very first quality of an effective design organization, and this is true of any organization, is an explicit shared sense of purpose. Because with that, with everyone in that team on board with why they exist and what is the problem that they're joining together to try to solve, if that is authentically and honestly embraced, everything else falls away. It's why USAA, it's why the customers love USAA, because their mission is around member service, right? They don't let their job titles get in the way of what does it take to deliver the best service to that member, right? And you need that clarity of purpose to drive that kind of coordinated effort in order to achieve those outcomes.
Peter, thank you so much for your time. This has been a very much needed reality check for everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. I don't tend to talk or work much in the AI space, so this opportunity to think about it with you all. And on that note, I am eager for anyone listening to this to challenge anything I have said. And if there's anything that those folks are taking issue with, I'm learning, I think, as we all are. And so share that evidence, share those data points.
Where is the best way for them to challenge you?
You can email me directly, peter@petermerholtz.com, or there's a contact page on my website at petermerholtz.com, or I'm assuming there will be some mention of this on the service known as LinkedIn. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn, and that is probably still the best place for dialogue or conversation around work-related topics out there.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast, where we interview AI leaders and discuss the latest innovations. We help teams learn how to leverage AI to reshape their industries. If you like learning about AI and how to grow your career, make sure to follow us on your favorite podcasting app. To get more AI and career resources, make sure to subscribe to our Substack at designofai.substack.com. It also really helps us if you leave reviews. This episode was hosted by Arpi Drag-Figueroa, the founder and head of product strategy at PH1 Research, and Brittany Hobbs, the VP Insights at Huge.